Okay, we're live.
Peace, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Geechee, y'all, and here with my brother Asafo from the Barter and Build think tank. And we are starting a new thing, and it's called BABTalks. And whereas Barter and Build Talks, where we bring in different guests from different walks of life, different experts, and it's just to have dialogue around things that are important to our people and just this country in general. So today we have Mrs. Stephanie Southworth. Please go ahead and introduce yourself before we get started.
I'm Stephanie Southworth. I'm a Senior Lecturer of Sociology at Coastal Carolina University. I've lived in Myrtle Beach for about 5.5 years, and I study social inequality, stratification, racial inequality, poverty, and homelessness.
Awesome. So within the last month or so, our think tank has been really going in on economics, wealth, and we're just kind of breaking up some myths. So today's show is going to be around those things and kind of dealing with a few myths. And we'll start off with Brother Asafo. We'll probably go back and forth like a tennis court with questions. And then towards the end, anybody who's watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can ask your questions in there and we'll make sure that Ms. Stephanie get those questions. So let's start out with Asafo with his first question for Ms. Stephanie.
Thank you very much. Now, before we get into the questions, now you've done a lot of work with the homeless in Horry County and specifically Myrtle Beach. Could you tell us a little more specifics about the work and research you've done concerning homelessness here in Horry County?
Sure. So about 4 years ago, a colleague and I started having our classes interview homeless people. We thought it would be a really interesting experience, give the students some experience doing qualitative research, interviewing people. And we thought we would have a fundraiser and we would get donated socks or something like that. And it was not too long that we realized that homeless people don't need socks. There are so many more things that they need. So we continued on with our research, and 250 interviews later, we find that the homeless need housing. That housing is unaffordable. Over 50% of the people we talked to had one or more jobs. They just could not afford housing. Numerous people had mental illness. They couldn't get a job with mental illness, and there weren't any resources to help them. Numerous people had serious physical disabilities, and at the shelter they were like, get a job, and they were like, I can't, I have a broken back. And then transportation was a really big problem. So we started a bike share program at the homeless shelter and a couple other agencies where people that are homeless can borrow bikes to get them to see their family, go to work, whatever. That was something that we thought we could actually be a part of and do something, whereas, socks wasn't cutting it.
Right. And the reason I asked you, started off with that question, Professor Southworth, is because I wanted our listeners and viewers to understand that you're someone with a lot of experience and dealing with the homeless, especially in our community. You've done a massive amount of research studying poverty and how people become impoverished and how people become homeless. Let me ask you this question, and this is going to the myth piece that we discussed. Is poverty a result of lack of hard work? Is poverty a result of not having the right mindset or having a negative or what they call a poverty mindset or anything like that? Is that what causes poverty?
Absolutely not. Poverty is caused before a child is born. Poor women get very poor prenatal care, and children who are born poor are not born as healthy. When they get into schools, we have tax-funded school systems. So the kids that live in poor neighborhoods are not going to go to well-funded schools. Then when they graduate, if they graduate, going to college is not always an option. Actually, we have more Black men in prison than we do in college. It's not just one thing. And if somebody is middle class, there can be one or two things that can put them right into poverty. It's the middle class right now is very unstable. One health scare, one, lost job. Most people only have a couple months worth of savings, if that. 2 months is probably about the most a middle class person can live without, experiencing serious problems.
So I want to stay in that area because along with hearing how poverty is created, or not necessarily hearing how poverty is created, but how to respond to poverty and what will solve poverty, one of the things you hear is home ownership, right? And so I want to kind of briefly ask that question and preface it between when the 1968 Housing Act, before that happened, Black folks who were getting houses were probably by luck, probably by people that you knew, connections. And even some of those, they had some nuance to it. But it was around 38% of Black people before the time having homes, right? As of 2019, 42% of these Black folks are owning homes. Do you think that shows any substantial change in Black folks building wealth in America, or has it kind of still remained the same in terms of wealth?
There are more Black people in the middle class than there was in 1968. The problem is with housing is that, the Fair Housing Act and the FHA discrimination was, became illegal, theoretically anyways, allowing non-whites to buy houses. But the problem is that when they did go in and buy houses, real estate agents and developers came in after them and started blockbusting in the neighborhoods. They would knock on the white people's door and say, "You don't want to live here. Look what's moving in." And so when the white people left, they took their wealth with them. And so although there is a little bit higher rates of home ownership, the wealth is not accumulating in those neighborhoods that are still segregated as they were in the 1960s, in the same way that wealth is accumulating in white neighborhoods. So, there was some progress, but it stopped. It did not continue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense.
Yeah. So you're saying is that there's just as in where you talk about neighborhoods and housing, even when it comes to education in America, that there's just as much, just as pervasive amount of segregation today as there was in the 1960s.
There is, maybe even more. And the thing is, like, there's more poor white people who are poor than poor Black people or poor Hispanic people. But you don't see poor white schools. You don't see kids, all the poor white kids in the same school, because they never had that residential segregation. So the poor white kid is kind of scattered in the trailer parks in between the middle class neighborhoods. And so they end up going to school with the middle class kids. They get that tax base from the property in that neighborhood, whereas the poor Black kids or the poor Hispanic kids end up being kind of shoved over into their own neighborhoods and their own schools that is in these communities that have been disinvested for generations. And so they end up, because we rely so heavily on property taxes to fund schools, they end up going to crappy schools. So, the poor kid graduates and says, I did it, why can't you? It's not the same.
So let's step back a minute. Let's to a broader question about poverty. With your expertise, Professor Southworth, can you explain to our audience who are America's poor?
Most of the poor, numerically, are white, disabled, children, elderly. There's a stereotype that, minorities make up the majority of the poor, or that poor people are people that chose to be poor, or are poor because they're lazy, they're living on the system, whatever that means. But in reality, poverty is a function of being a child and not able to work, being disabled and not able to work, being elderly and not able to work, people that work all their lives have become poor and they have Social Security, but we don't have housing that Social Security can afford. There are lots and lots of poor people that work harder than I do, a lot harder than I do, and a lot more hours. Work and poverty are not mutually exclusive at all.
So I want to build off of that, right? And so it is acknowledged that there's more white poor people than there are black poor people. And if that be true, numbers says it's accurate. When we talk about policy, then policy for the poor might not address the wealth gap and the issues for black folks, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to preface this question with, politicians, policy, and let's go back to kind of LBJ when he had this like racial equality propaganda that he was going out, and prior to that, he kind of was the front person for blocking a lot of progress. But when his time to run for president, he became more of like this neoliberal pseudo progress person, kind of using MLK for a prop, well, I would like to say. But I want you to kind of speak to his rhetoric, right? Saying these fly things and the policies that actually impact us. And what would you say him and people like him have done for like the conditions of poverty in America? Right? That's the first question. What have people like him done for poverty in America? And then the second question, I want you to answer, how should specifically black people engage with political leaders in the future, knowing that there are politicians who can say the right things, but not really follow through with policy?
Right. So Johnson was a racist, flat out, no question. There's no denying that. He was also a politician. So he passes all these policies, and if they hadn't been systematically shut down and altered, they could have been good policies. The Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. Actually, until the Civil Rights Act, schools weren't desegregating. And after the Civil Rights Act, when they linked federal funding to desegregation, that was the only period of time in our history that we've had any kind of desegregated schools, from about the 1960s through 1980. So there were good policies, but at the same time, he wasn't doing those because he wanted to. He was doing them because he thought they could give him the most votes. At the same time he was cracking down on Ku Klux Klan, he was also cracking down on civil rights leaders. It was like he's putting out a bunch of fires in order to see, where the votes would land. I don't really study LBJ. I study the policies, but that's kind of what I think of when I think about him, is the fact that, he was just trying to get, these votes passed. But, until 1980, we were making progress, and it could have been good. And then Ronald Reagan came in and cut the Department of Education, cut welfare, cut all these social safety nets. In late 1970s, they thought that homelessness was going to be a thing of the past, so that we wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And by the time Reagan's first 4 years had expired, there were 500,000 homeless people out here. So, policies matter. They really do. And most of the time, it's not that one person that's making that policy. It's all these people around them that are telling them what's going to get them the votes. I really believe that there's not a politician that makes policies out of the goodness of their heart. And what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
No worries. And I don't want to make you be an expert for telling Black folks how to engage, but based off of your study, based off your experience, how would you advise people, specifically Black people, to engage with the political structure, knowing that LBJs and Obamas and even Bidens will say all kind of camouflage things? Like, I don't know if you saw the video when Biden said all these things, and then when he got those Black leaders on a Zoom meeting, and looked like he looked like the old Biden. So how would you suggest that Black folks engage with some of these politicians, especially around their policies and rhetoric versus policies?
Well, I'm not a politician or a political economist, but there are some politicians that aren't just in it for the vote, and they do have a vote, right, in Congress. So, I don't think trying to talk to Biden is going to do anybody any good. It's getting the people in the Senate and getting the people, the other people in Congress and talking to them. Elizabeth Warren can be an advocate. I don't think she ran for president to be president. I think she ran for president because she wanted to get a voice out there. I don't think she really ever thought she could become president. I think some of these politicians that are quieter also, that don't really care about we have these people that can be politicians for their life. Find somebody that's ready to not expire, that's ready to retire, right? To get out of politics and talk to them and have them, talk to everybody else. But like I said, that's opinion. That's not my expert opinion. That's just what I think. Because I'm not a political scientist.
Right. So, you mentioned the 1980s and Reagan, and so along with that, we can also discuss the rise of neoliberalism as the prevailing ideology, political ideology. We could talk about Reagan. We could also talk about Margaret Thatcher. We could talk about a host of other political leaders who have come to embrace neoliberalism as their ideological underpinnings for the policy that they promote. Could you tell our audience a little bit about what neoliberalism is and how it has manifested itself in the modern context?
So, starting with Reagan, he was like, we need to cut funding. We need to cut all these programs. The government needs to stay out of people's lives. And he did. He cut. The neoliberalism is this idea that, government intervention is harmful and the government's too big and it needs to step back. And so he set out to cut, welfare, food stamps, education, environment, infrastructure, anything he could cut, he did. While at the same time giving tax cuts to corporations, spending extraordinary amounts on the military, bulking up our military because he was so afraid of communism.
Deregulation.
Deregulation, fired all the air traffic controllers that were federal, and by the time he left 8 years later, we had gone from a creditor nation to a debtors nation. So neoliberalism, in my opinion, is not all it's cut out to be, right? You cut, but then you spend, on people that you think are going to benefit you. Once again, he was a politician. Those poor people aren't going to understand or not going to care or not going to be able to fight if you cut their education funding. But this corporation is really important, so we're going to cut their taxes. And he actually ended up having to go back and, raise their taxes once because he cut them too much. There was no money left. And that has not. And so that's what I think we were, regardless of the intentions, we were on a path towards, we could have not been here before 1980. And it was almost like he took us back, not to 1968, but to 1958, as far as the schools and the housing and everything else. And it hasn't stopped. Neoliberalism, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, neoliberalism is an entrenched part of politics now.
Now we've so we've seen that going from the 80s even till today with neoliberalism, and it's the results. I would suppose that they've been rearing their ugly head, but the results are becoming more entrenched, more obvious now. We had so much so that we actually at one point had the United Nations send a special rapporteur to the United States to study poverty. You're familiar with the resulting study. What did that special rapporteur find in the United States in regards to poverty?
So I think we should be embarrassed that the United Nations sent somebody to study our poverty. I mean, I think we as a country should be humiliated. So Philip Alston came and he toured. He went all across the country and he wanted to see how poor people lived here. And he was shocked that nobody had any teeth because they couldn't get dental care, that children's teeth were rotting out of their heads. He's like, at the very least, teeth. Like, this is so important. He was shocked about the health care. He couldn't believe this extreme inequality. We're one of the richest countries in the world, but we also have the most inequality and the most poverty out of any industrialized country. Like, he was horrified. He really was. I actually teach a class on his visit and show my students what he said. We watch a video and he was just like, I can't believe these people are living without clean water. These people are living without, health care. These people, can't go to a doctor. He was very horrified. And I think we as a country should be embarrassed.
So it's almost like we're in class right now with these definitions. I got a definition as well. So by all means, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, make sure you share with some friends and family. And we have a portion where you can ask questions. So get your questions in your comments. So speaking about the wealth disparities, speaking about neoliberalism and progress, which is always a debatable thing. Like, have we made progress? Have we not? What is progress? What is not? And so one of the things I want you to explain is economism, right? That term, and just to understand it for the people at home, it pretty much explains that there's a fight from the government to do any intervention for its past sins, right? So you'll see programs that are kind of like glitzery and glamoury instead of dealing with the people, right? So can you kind of explain economisms, if you even see it as it being different than neoliberalism, but to the best ability, explain that to people?
Well, it is a little bit different. The idea is that it would hurt the economy to do some of these things. So neoliberalism is more about people's rights to be free from government intervention. And this economism is more about, but if we do this, it'll cost too much money. And then our economy will shatter or whatever. My argument, if I was the one making all the rules, I think investing in education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff would actually reforming the criminal justice system. I think that all of that stuff would actually be better for the economy and not worse for the economy. So I think that's a failed argument, just as failed of an argument as neoliberalism. If you think about when we shut down all the mental health facilities, the institutions in the 1960s and 70s, some of them weren't run very well, But who do we have helping our mentally ill now? The prison system. Like those people were shifted from one institution to another. And I don't really care how bad the mental institutions were run. They were run better than prisons, right? So we have, you have help for people's mental health. You wouldn't need as many prisons. You wouldn't need as many police officers. You wouldn't need as many counselors. You could invest that money into the community and not, into the prison system and starting all these, looking at kids in their third grade and saying, let's see how many prison beds we'll need in 10 years. That's not okay. It's not okay. In no world is that okay.
So I'm traveling quite a bit, and one of the countries that I go to often is Costa Rica, who doesn't have a military, and they have that money spent in healthcare, education, have one of the higher literacy rates, and obviously free healthcare. In fact, interactions with the police, I'm not advising anybody drive drunk, but interactions with the police, if you're driving drunk, they'll stop you, pull you over, take you home, and say you're gonna have to come get your car the next day. Like that's literally like some of the energy. So with that said, when people hear that these people are being economically or politically dominated because of something that has been consistent, and it's better, instead of handling that and fixing that, to make healthy humans, right? With COVID, we find that America probably has a third world type healthcare system. But instead of expiating these people, repairing them, you are creating propaganda that make them blame themselves. So what do you think that says about a country who will victimize people and then help them create in their minds that they actually are the reason? Well, you're not doing this, and you shouldn't be doing this, and you could do this to change. What does that say about a country, in your opinion?
We have a horrible education system. When kids get to college and I tell them, here we go, we're going to go on this journey and give you the real history of the United States, they're shocked and they want to do something. You can't do something about something you don't know anything about. If you don't know any better, and that's you, me. I mean, my opinion changes regularly when I get new information. I could not 10 years ago have to sit here and talk to you about any of this stuff because I didn't know. At 5 years ago, I couldn't have talked about issues of the homeless because I thought they needed socks, right? I had no idea. I just wanted to help, right? But the only way I could help is by learning. And luckily, I'm in a position where I can go out and talk to people and find out what they need, or I can teach students. I mean, I tell them every semester, you are our future leaders. You need to keep these books and learn these books and not just memorize and forget. I tell, they get mad at me because I won't give them multiple choice tests. And I'm like, because you need to learn this. This stuff is important. I don't know if there's anything we can do in a week or a year or 5 years, but I think if we just educate, people, a lot of my students are in that situation and they didn't even realize why it was so hard to get out, because they're told their whole life, work hard and everything will be fine. And they're like, but it's not fine. So I must be doing something wrong. And so then they're sitting in my class and I'm like, it's not you. You're not doing anything wrong. It's a system. And that's the only thing we can do, really, as far as, we can't change the federal government in the way that their propaganda machine. It's just, maybe we can, but I don't know a way. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Real quick. So in my traveling in and out of the country, I had to come back in the country recently. First day I get there, me and my cousin who were harassed by Miami PD. My cousin was at the ATM. I was in the car. They walk up on him and they looked like they was questioning him, and then they sent up searching him. So I get out the car with a water bottle that looks like this. And the first thing the cop said was, "Is that alcohol?" And because I have history with cops, my tolerance is kind of low. I said, "Look, I ain't got time to play. What's going on?" He was like, "Well, look like alcohol to me." Anyway, they asked him, the first question they asked him, "Do you feel targeted?" He said, "Yes." At the ATM, and cops are questioning me. Of course, what else would I feel? And supposedly there was some kind of call that a person was being harmed and whatever, but they wasn't able to give us any details about it, like the description of the person, the car, and all these other things. We was just in the area. Then, as he's checking, because my cousin has a legal gun, so he's checking to see if that's legal, right? He just can't believe that it's legal. He said, "Let me check." Then he said, "By the way, a lot of times we are prejudging you guys and blah, blah, blah. And they're trying to pretty much clean their whole plate." And I asked the question that I ask in all workshops. I do workshops with law enforcement in Virginia and in Baltimore. Simple question: do you trust politicians? All police say no, really quick, immediately. And I'm like, okay, so you're questioning us for not trusting you, but you don't trust the people who make the laws you enforce on us. Does that make sense? And they started stuttering, and then quickly there's, "Okay, you guys can go." They wanted us to go. They didn't want to talk anymore. I was like, "Hey, I thought y'all wanted to talk. Let's talk." And so, but one of them did admit to me, he was like, "Well, there's nothing we can do, because even if we do the right thing, the boss won't allow us to do it." And so, in a sense, everybody is educated and propagated into being hopeless, right? So that the minority that's ruling most of the resources could, be in bliss. I guess that's where ignorance is bliss comes from. Not really bliss.
Probably.
Go ahead, Asafo.
If you don't know something, you don't have to do anything about it.
Yeah, maybe.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this, Professor Southworth. What role does race and geography play in the maintenance of poverty in communities?
Well, I think I kind of alluded to that in several other of my answers, but there was a period in time, and I know you guys know this, but where mortgage lenders would not lend to people that lived in minority neighborhoods. Not only would they not give them money to move out to these newly built suburbs, but they also wouldn't give businesses or allow people to take out loans to make their own house better, right? And so over, generations, these communities that people had been pushed into and segregated into were, as I said before, disinvested. They were not invested in. There weren't businesses in there. I don't know if you've ever heard of Hayti in North Carolina. It was like the Black Wall Street. It was a wonderful community, had the largest Black-owned insurance company. And when Raleigh wanted to build a freeway, rather than build it through the white neighborhood, they built it right through Hayti and destroyed that community. So over time, it was like any time a segregated minority community, and mostly Black communities, started doing something, a road was built like through the community or something happened. And so even today in 2021, middle-class minorities are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are lower, that are more affordable for them. Whereas white people are more likely to live in more housing than they can afford. They might struggle to pay for it, but that wealth is increasing and increasing. Whereas if you're living in a neighborhood that is less than you can afford, you're not gaining as much wealth. If it's in a part of the town that has been historically segregated, then once again, it doesn't have those resources for the schools and everything else. And so place makes a difference. The only place the white people are really concentrated, poor white people, is in the mountains. And in the Appalachias, poor white kids are in the same situation as a lot of, inner city minorities that they're just forgotten. When the water system and the the car industry in Detroit left, and then the water was so bad, everybody that could left. And what you see is an entire city that's just become depopulated and poor. And the only people that are left there are the people that couldn't get out. So place makes a huge difference in terms of getting ahead. You know, you see these, what do you call it, rags to riches stories. Those people didn't do that themselves. They had somebody that was pushing them along, helping them, giving them something. And that's not just for minorities, but it happens more. For example, when I graduated with my PhD, I had 2 little children, and I had gotten divorced and ended up with all this debt. And I would have been on the street if I didn't borrow money from somebody. You know, if you know somebody, and you're more likely to know somebody that has that kind of money to borrow if you're around people that aren't poor. You know, poor people don't have thousands of dollars to lend. So race and place, both of them really matter. Did that answer your question?
Yes. So what you're saying is, you know, again, going back to the mythology piece that we discussed at the beginning of the conversation. So the dissolution, if you will, of Black communities, the impoverishing of Black communities, these once thriving, growing, you know, communities, the collapse of these communities is not because of welfare or, you know, hip hop or any of the other things that we've come to embrace. There are political, structural, exogenous factors at play that led to the dissolution of these communities. Is that what you're saying?
And the criminal justice system.
In the criminal justice system, absolutely.
It can't be stressed enough how dangerous and destructive the criminal, along with all this other stuff, the criminal justice system has been for particularly Black men. You know, like I said earlier, there are more Black men imprisoned than getting a college degree, and why that doesn't just blow people's mind and make them want to do something about it. It's a lot of like petty stuff. It's not like they're all run around hurting people. It's petty drug crimes and misdemeanors that build up. You know, that can't be forgotten. So yeah, race, place, the political destruction, you know, and then you run the risk of being like, well, what can we do if we can't do anything? Does anybody have a chance, right? But you know, there are some strong communities out there, and there are some strong leaders like you guys that can, you know, help make change. But it just, when I think about all that's been done, it's just pretty horrible.
So I want to kind of stay there, but also pull some of the information back from the last question. And I just immediately started thinking about, like, when you talk about the petty drug crimes, we talked a lot that both of us been to college, and I spent some time at a PWI, and I know there's more drugs on the campus than there are in the hood that I came in. So definitely policing is a difference. But I want to know, and you alluded to this a little bit, how does the power structure engage with poor and working class whites? And then how is, from your experience, how is that relation with those poor and working class whites to Black, right? So obviously both of them are somewhat being dominated by a power structure. So I want to know, how do you see the poor and working class white engage with the power structure? And then in turn, how do those poor and working class whites engage with Black people at large?
Well, I think once again, it gets back to place, right? So working class minorities tend to be in these segregated communities that, you know, the police patrol those neighborhoods because they're told that those are the dangerous neighborhoods. Whereas poor whites are, once again, in the trailer park next to, you know, the low income community. So it's in I teach several criminal justice classes, and one of the things I like to tell students, I don't like to tell, but it's something that gets to them, is that take a Black kid and a white kid and they're both smoking marijuana, and actually white kids are more likely to smoke marijuana. They're actually more likely to sell it too. Two kids doing the same thing. The white kid's more likely to get arrested. If he's arrested, he's more likely to get charged. If he's charged, he's more likely to get convicted. And if he's convicted, the black kid's more likely to be convicted, to get more time in jail. So you have these two people with this, dialogue about what it means to be a poor white and what it means to be a poor black. They do the exact same thing with very, very different consequences. One gets a slap on the wrist and is sent home to mom and dad, and the other one is seen as an adult and sent into the criminal justice system, and maybe they can call somebody when they get there. I don't know if that answered your question either. I'm getting confused, but it's a different, when there's different stereotypes, there's different kinds of interactions, and a lot of these lower income, areas that a lot of poor whites live might be like the small town where, the sheriff, right? The white family is friends with the sheriff and has them over for dinner. The areas where, minorities are segregated into are not this, don't have the same community relationships. So there's a lot.
Yeah. As you was talking, I heard, I remember people talk about like trailer park and this and that. And I guess I never really thought about the economics behind trailer parks. I know trailers are less expensive than houses and maybe even, I don't know if anybody ever did any studies or whatever, but those people in the trailer parks, do they own it? Are they paying rent? Like what this wealth thing? But my main question was, go ahead.
That's a bad situation for them too. If you're interested, there's a book called Eviction by Matthew Desmond that looks at trailer parks and low-income apartment complexes. They own the trailer, but they very seldom own the land.
Right.
And so they pay this land rent, and if they lose the land rent, then they lose. If they don't pay the land rent, then they don't have the trailer anymore because they don't have the money to move it. So that's another situation that's kind of squirrely. But yeah, that you should read that book. It's very good. I think.
Okay. I'll definitely check it out. The second part of the question was mainly because there are some of the things that you mentioned about, like, even if the poor white working class or whatever, they still have certain advantages. And with those advantages, we know like the government and the power structure have somewhat weaponized them so that they never can kind of get together. So from your experience, if you've experienced working in your field, do you see certain attitudes with poor whites, working class whites, as it relates to how they connect with Black populations?
Yeah. With any community, and I see this even in the homeless community, it is to the advantage of the higher ups to pit people against each other. If you have these stereotypes about each other and you say, well, these people are lazy and these people will steal your last dollar from you or whatever, then that actually serves the politicians, because then they'll never get together and actually vote for somebody that's going to benefit them, right? Because there aren't many policies that actually benefit the poor without also benefiting somebody that's not poor. So like when I'm in the homeless shelter, even people that work that stay there, that they're all staying there, and they'll point at somebody and say, "Oh, I'm not like them. They're all lazy. They don't want to work. Blah blah blah. I'm different." Even if they're in the same situation, even if they're not working, they're like, well, if my back wasn't broken, I would get a job. And then I say, well, their back's broken too. And they're like, yeah, but they're just lazy. Like, it's always the lowest classes of people that the higher ups kind of make this narrative where they're talking bad about each other, when they would do so much better if they could just understand their common interests and get a sense of class consciousness rather than this false consciousness that they tend to feel.
All right, so we wanted also to, kind of have a conversation more specifically around housing and homelessness. Um, again, dealing with the mythology, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but I want you to kind of hone in on the idea of homelessness, why homelessness has become as pervasive as it has uh, in recent years, or has it become pervasive?
So once again, we used to have social safety nets. We don't anymore. Somebody can only get cash assistance if they're poor, like welfare, the typical welfare, what you think of, for 5 years. And after that, they can't get any more. And what they can get is, I think in South Carolina, it's like $300 a month or something. That's never going to help lift anybody out of poverty. And that's why, people are this unemployment insurance is so important. People will say, well, they're not getting a job because they have this unemployment insurance. Well, if the job would pay them a decent wage, they would want to go to work, and they would pay for shelter. Housing is unaffordable, and Myrtle Beach is pretty cheap compared to a lot of places, but it's still unaffordable. You can't work 40 hours a week at $10 an hour and afford a 1-bedroom apartment in Myrtle Beach. You just can't do it. And then if you are working those low-wage jobs, it's hard to save up for a down payment and the first month's rent and get your electricity hooked up. And it is expensive to move into a place. And if you're working for $10 an hour, and that's not even minimum wage, right? But I'm saying $10 an hour because at least people at $10 an hour are making more than minimum wage. It's still not enough. And then one thing happens. You go to the doctor and have to spend $200 for something. That's it. And that's with insurance most of the time. People are becoming homeless because there's no social safety nets to catch them. Middle class people are becoming homeless. The story I always like to tell is the 68-year-old guy moved here from Maryland to help his parents. He's like, I was a school counselor for 30 years, but I spent all my money on my parents, and then they died. They were renting their house, and now I get a Social Security check, and I can afford an apartment with it, but then I wouldn't be able to eat. So I'm in the shelter at 68 years old for the first time in my life. And it's just like mind-blowing that we're allowing somebody 68 years old to live in a homeless shelter. As a society, we should not. Right. This is not acceptable.
Right. 68 years old, well-educated. I presume you would have to be a school counselor.
Probably just a bachelor's degree, but yeah.
Right. Worked hard all of his life, and at 68 years old ends up homeless for reasons that are really beyond his control. And that's the type of narrative that people need to hear. That a lot of this homelessness, a lot of the poverty that we're seeing, a lot of the stagnation, economic stagnation that we're seeing, or the economic malaise, if you will, are due to exogenous factors. This is not, just an idea of someone not being willing to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. With the issue of homelessness, we also need to consider shelter poverty as well. What could you tell our audience what shelter poverty is and how that ties to homelessness?
Well, when you have an income, but you're spending it all on your housing, or you have money for everything but housing, people that are spending, there are people spending 50-60% of their income on their home. And they're not living in Beverly Hills, right? They're living in what they can afford. And so they're shelter poor because they're spending everything they've got on housing. And so, what happens if your car breaks down? You have to choose between your car and your rent. What happens if your kid gets sick? When I was a kid, I'm older than you, So it might not have been this way even 10 years later. But when I was a kid, my mom took me to the doctor. We had insurance. We didn't have to pay anything, or we had to pay $5, or it was very, very low. Now, when I go to the doctor, I have insurance, and I'm still like, do I want to go to the doctor? Do I want to spend that money? Like, it's hard, for somebody that is trying to decide whether to take their child to the doctor or pay their rent or their home. What do you do? And what would be really nice, and this was in Elizabeth Warren's 2019 plan, is she had proposed having support. So if somebody can't pay their rent for a month or 2 months, there was something that could prop them up, and they wouldn't have to pay them back, or if they did have to pay it back, it would be without interest. That could lift all sorts of people out of poverty who, because most people aren't in poverty their whole life. Most people kind of go in and out of it as circumstances arise. And so, you could keep a lot of people from ending up in poverty just by having a housing safety net, or providing low interest or no interest home loans to help them gain wealth on top of having a place to stay. But shelter poverty is not from people buying big houses and then not being able to afford them.
What do you think is the problem with or the disconnect with people? Obviously is media propagation, textbooks, and other things that will tell you that financial literacy is our only hope, which Jay-Z will say as well, or freedom, whatever you say. Where's the disconnect between financial literacy is not the solution for poverty? Like, what, what I mean? Not only people and systems that's putting it out and organizations that's putting it out, but where do you think that people are like disconnecting with financial literacy and poverty?
I would think if somebody believes that, they haven't met very many poor people, because the poor people that I've met are very financially literate. They know how to stretch a dollar. I am sometimes my friends that are quite poor shocked at how much food they can make out of a chicken. Like, stretching it so that so many people can have dinner or whatever. I don't think financial literacy is the problem. If if the minimum wage is $7 something an hour, and it costs, Horry County admits that for a 2-bedroom apartment, the minimum you would need is $14 an hour, but their minimum wage is $7.25 or whatever it is. There's this $7 an hour disconnect. Social, like I said several times, these social safety nets, unemployment insurance, that, income supports. There are so many things besides financial literacy. I just, maybe we should have financial literacy for wealthy people and make them figure out how to pay their taxes. Because I'm going to get in trouble if I don't pay my taxes, but Obama can kind of slide by if he wanted to. He probably won't, but
yeah, I like that. I like that literacy there.
Really, if we crack down on corporations and people that are very wealthy and just had them pay their fair share, a lot of this stuff could be resolved. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. But we have this dialogue. I've had to, over the last 6 months, cut out a lot of my friendships with people and some family, because they're so willing to blame the victim for everything that happens. And I really think that education, literacy, as in real literacy, real history, is much more important than financial literacy.
So, we both live here in Horry County, Professor Southworth, and I know Horry County has one of the lowest tax rates in the state in regards to taxes and property taxes, what have you. It shocked me, but that, again, you're having just a horrifically low tax rate. You kind of have to question the assessor, who is, kind of little more than, a banal libertarian used car salesman. That's who we have as our tax assessor. But it there ends up being kind of a tax on poor people in regards to the fines and fees that are levied for this kind of different infractions and what have you. And that, like I said, that ends up being kind of an additional tax on poor people. And invariably, I would suspect that makes up for the budgetary shortfalls that come from having such a low tax rate. So the wealthy people in this area are able to skate on paying such low taxes, while the poor people are paying the taxes they're paying, and then in addition being hit so frequently with these fines and fees.
Well, it's not just fines and fees. It's very expensive. It's much more expensive to be poor. Actual money that goes out is more for people that are impoverished or living in impoverished communities than it is for upper middle class people. You have two people, he asked them how much they spent in a week, and the actual necessities, the upper middle class person is going to spend less money. They're going to spend less money on these fines and fees. They're going to spend less money at the gas station. They're going to spend less money at the grocery store. They're going to spend less money on healthcare because they likely have insurance. They're going to spend less money at the dentist because they have insurance. They're not going to be forced to shop at 7-Eleven for their groceries. They could go to Aldi or whatever and spend less money because they can get to Aldi if they wanted to. And Aldi, if you don't know, is a very lovely, low-cost grocery store. Props for Aldi. But yeah, it's once again, because are they going to say something? They don't have that political power to say, hey, we're bearing the brunt of all these fees. And if they just decide if they decide not to pay it, they're not going to go to the news and have the news make a big issue of it. Whereas a wealthy person, they just call up somebody and say, put this on the news because it's not fair. And then they would end up getting that waived. People that are not low income live a lot better because of low income people, unfortunately.
So could you go ahead, Geechee.
No, I was about to just remind people, if you wanted to ask a question, please comment your question. Whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, you can comment your question and we'll add it to the field. Go ahead.
So you mentioned a little bit about the Elizabeth Warren's American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. Now we have that as one of the policies on our Black voter project. We have a list of policies that we believe would be beneficial to the Black community, and that actual act is one of those one of the policies when it comes to housing. Could you tell us a little bit about that act? A little bit more, rather, about that act?
Well, Elizabeth Warren and a couple of colleagues recognized that housing is unaffordable, recognized that people who, are housed, and a lot of people that are housed are at one paycheck or one lost job or whatever away from, living on the street. She also recognized that there's lots of people, you spend a lot more money for rent than you do if you own your home. That's just one more way that people that are poor spend more money. It's like $500 more to rent a house than it is to be paying on a mortgage. So this plan was a way to kind of provide the social safety nets for people that are paying on a mortgage and something happens to them. But it was also a way to get people out of renting and into home ownership through, a variety of ways, low interest or no interest loans, helping with deposits, down payment. We already have that plan for rural. If you buy a house in a rural area and you get on the USDA mortgage, you don't have to put any down payment. So it's not like it's some new exotic thing. We do it already. So she just has a bunch of kind of ways to kind of support people that want to own a home that, just haven't been able to, and then to support people from falling out of the homeowner market or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so we have that as one of our policies, and I think the entire team is in agreement that housing should be a human right. We see the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act as a floor. We're to where we should be as black voters and the black community, to where we ask any politician who approaches us for our vote, this is the floor. This act is the floor. Now, if you could do better than that, fine. But if you're not even willing to meet us at that level, you're not even deserving of our vote. So this is the bare minimum when it comes to housing that any politician should have when it comes to trying to get the black vote. So that's why we've included it on our list of policies.
I think part of that policy, act that was written in 2019 was for increased funding for schools as well, that schools shouldn't be dependent on property taxes. I think that was part of that bill, and that is very important. And it's a very important part of that bill because, if people own homes, but their kids go to a crummy school, who's going to want to own that home? Parents want their kids to go to good schools, and they need to get out of, to do well when they get out.
Right. So removing that, removing property taxes as the main way to fund and subsidize public schools would be a major step in the right direction, in my opinion, to educational equality. And you've known me for years. I've worked for a long time as an educational activist here in Horry County, and I see the results. I mean, the results are right in your face when it comes to the disparities that come from a lack of funding. So I'm 100% in agreement with that. Geechee, did you?
Yeah. So
did you
I
want
got
to
one.
chime in?
Yeah. Just one last question. As we are wrapping up, and by all means, anybody who have questions, go in. So often we talk about myths. We've able to get the data and the research and the information to debunk myths, but sometimes even going into looking at how these things have started kind of baffles me, right? So you can go into any Black community right now, and I'm willing to bet even some outside of the country, and they will tell you that Jewish dollar circulates this many times and Black dollar is only 6 out. They would literally tell you that. And tracking where it come from a book that a lady wrote, I think in '93, that a bot study from a person who doesn't even exist, right? So one of the things I want you to, at least for this final question, is there's a lot of thoughts out there that, when we find out who created the thoughts, and how we accept it as axiomatic, to kind of neutralize that. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan talked about this tangle of pathology that Black people have in their decision makings, and these are the things that are causing them to experience white hegemony or white terrorism. It's like it's on them. What are some final words to neutralize that, and what are some resources to help people get that through their head, whether it be white or Black people, to kind of get that through their head, that Black decision making is not what equate to white terrorism and white hegemony?
education. I mean, I really, I tried to talk to some people that I used to be close to and that are in my family. And, this seems to have like gotten worse over the last 4.5 years or so, or 5 years, and try to dispel myths. But for some reason, talking to my friend or former friend or family member or whatever, they shut down. But you have the college professor in the classroom talking to them, and they're forced to read these books or whatever. They listen, and a lot of them change their minds. I think you need to have the people in power, and I know it's difficult, but somebody that has some kind of voice needs to be the voice, right? Somebody that people will listen to change their minds. Because, well, the whole reason that I ended up getting a PhD, I never planned on it, but I took a class in social inequality, and I'm like, but I've worked my whole life, and look at me, I worked real hard. I did this all myself. And my teacher said, no, you didn't. I'm like, what? How do I learn more about this? And I ended up getting a PhD because she hooked me. She made me question everything I had been told my entire life. And I wasn't even a kid. I was in my 30s when that happened. But I don't know if a friend of mine would have said, oh, you're wrong. That would have just been a debate, right? But somebody that you respect telling you that, maybe you'll listen. So I don't know what the answer is, except to get another MLK or somebody that people, like to listen to and is willing to speak loudly and carry a strong stick or whatever you call that. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Unfortunately, in our community, we do have those people. They're just the ones who's spreading the the wrong information. So we do have cultist personality people that everybody know, but there's also a staunch big case of anti-intellectualism where they actually don't respect those people, whatever.
Well, I think that's also why a lot of these people say, people that go to college are getting their brainwashed, right? It's this liberal whatever it is, and I don't think it's a liberal melting pot or whatever. I think it's like the real history, at least in the classes that I teach. I don't actually consider myself all that liberal. I just like facts.
Thank you.
Hold on. But yeah, before we let you go, could you tell us a little bit about the little bit more? I know you mentioned the Rolling Forward project before. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and just how you came about that and what it does?
So like I said, we started interviewing these people that were homeless, thinking that we were going to have just this class project. And at the end of the semester, my students would gather up some socks and we'd go hand them out. And then we realized that mental health care, transportation, and affordable housing were these things that 250 interviews later we keep coming back to. We also realized that a lot of these organizations, these nonprofits, they're like different groups. They don't talk to each other, they clash. I'm sure it's probably set up that way. So a colleague of mine started getting grants to start bike share programs. We started one in the men's shelter, in the transitional shelter for veterans, in the drop-in youth center. And so people that are homeless can borrow the bikes, get to work, go see their family, get to see their friends, and then bring them back when they're done. We also do resource fairs where we try to bring all these organizations together that usually don't talk all that much to each other in one place. We just had one Thursday, where we had like 6 or 7 different organizations in a park, and we go to where homeless people are, and they can stop by and get bags like resource bags or cards or whatever they need. And we're just continuing to do these interviews. We're trying to start a drop-in center in Conway where people can, stop in, and we could help them with another thing is IDs. They lose their IDs and they can't get another one. So help them with the paperwork to get their driver's license or their birth certificate or whatever they need to get their ID so they can get a job. So I'm hoping that's in the next year when COVID's gone, we'll have that drop-in center in Conway.
Absolutely. So I want to, as we wrap up, I want to, express my appreciation to you for coming on to our inaugural BABTalk series. We sincerely appreciate that. And, personally, I consider you a friend. Whenever, we've done events in the community, you're always there to help us. Whenever I call you, you come. You're always there when I need you, and I sincerely appreciate that. And I want to publicly, just express my appreciation to you for that. Is there any way that that people who are interested in more of your research, are interested in helping out with the Rolling Forward Project, can reach you?
My phone number is on the Rolling Forward Project webpage. Facebook page. There's also a link there to message me, or they can email me or call you or email you.
Okay. So, Geechee, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, thank you for your time and sharing with the audience and everybody on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you for coming through.
I appreciate you guys.